All right, Isaiah 28. Remember, the first 12 chapters covered a period of judgments and considerations against Judah and Jerusalem. We got to chapter 13, and from chapter 13 to 23 of Isaiah, we covered Isaiah's section, as the other major prophets do, on the nations, a judgment against the nations. And then beginning in chapter 24 through chapter 27 was another section, major section in our outline at least. We're going to be on the fourth section tonight. But that was really kind of capping off this section on the judgments against the nations in chapters 13 through 24. And what we saw was this generalization of those chapters, especially in chapter 24, this general world judgment, but then scattered throughout are some messianic considerations and prophecies, a lot of rays of light coming through the darkness, as you see throughout the prophets, especially with Isaiah. So when we get to chapter 28, it starts a new section, but we're still within this Assyrian period. Remember, I don't have it up here, but Harry has brought up in every one of his PowerPoints the historical outline, where you have the Assyrian period and chapters 1 through 38 and 39, rather. And then beginning in chapter 40, you're going to have the Babylonian period. And in chapters 36 through 39, you have the historical section, which kind of gives us that transition, a bridge into it. And we'll see why, because of Hezekiah's failure and his pride and his sin that ultimately would be the straw that broke the camel's back in Judah and would lead them into Babylonian captivity. So here we're still in the Assyrian period. We're going to see that some, how God's going to judge them with Assyria. And as we've noticed before, that's going to be limited. He's going to come all the way up to the neck, and that means all the way through Judah. He's going to take 46 cities, and Jerusalem is going to be spared, the head, the capital of Judah. And so they'll be judged in that way, and then we'll get to the other section where they're finally taken into captivity, or at least Isaiah's looking forward to that time. But here what you're going to see is, I think it's noted in the outline, it's not right there, but in your outline, if you have that before you, there's some comments there that says that this section deals with the reign of Hezekiah as chapters 7 through 12 does with Ahaz. So it's generally thought, especially when we get into chapter 29, that what's being described there is the siege against Jerusalem that Sennacherib made, and that ultimately was cut off, in the middle of the night, where the angel of the Lord slayed 185,000, and then he went back home, and a couple years later would be slayed by his own sons. There is some dispute about that, but I think that's pretty much what we're going to see. So remember chapter 7 through 12, a big problem that was pointed out in the reign of Ahaz was what? What was the threat, and how did he think he needed to handle it? Remember that? Assyria, right? But then there were two others that were trying to make Judah join an alliance, right? Right, Syria and Israel. You might have been saying Syria. I heard Assyria. So Assyria has always been the conflict, and Syria, that is Israel, or Syria and Israel, that is, not Assyria, they decide we're going to join an alliance against Assyria, so they're not trusting in God, but they want Judah to join, and Judah wasn't willing to join, and so they were going to fight against Judah and force their hand and set up a king themselves so that they would join that coalition, if you will. And God told Ahaz, don't worry about them too. And Ahaz did what? What was his solution to the problem? Do you trust in God? Who do you trust in? Assyria, right? If Assyria is coming against me, I'm going to try to, curry his favor and deal good with him and send him some tribute, and maybe he'll not take over me because of that. So you've got within that section of chapter 7 through 12, in the reign of Ahaz, the common problem of failing to wait on the Lord and trust in Him, and instead trusting in another nation or yourself or just another man, the arm of flesh. We're going to see that in chapters 28 through 35. The difference is, here is later on in the reign of Hezekiah after Ahaz. And Hezekiah, was he a good king or a bad king? We know Ahaz encouraged moral decline in Judah. What about Hezekiah? He was a good king, right? Probably one of the best kings of the southern nation of Judah after the divided kingdom. And so you've got this godly king that is actually going to end up being a part of why, I understand that it's been prophesied up to this point, but his prayer was a large part that activated the providence of God and kept Judah or Jerusalem ultimately from being taken, and God answered his prayer. And then you have, of course, as he's a man, a failure after that, and that would lead them into Babylonian captivity. But here you got a very good king, a godly king, one who wants to do the will of the Lord, is following after the steps of his father's David, as you see throughout the kings that description is used. And here's my point. The damage has already been done. When you've got a leadership that has encouraged that kind of moral decline, as the book of Kings describes Ahaz is doing, and leading the people away from trusting in God and instead trusting in politics and these alliances and trusting in themselves and their own wisdom, by the time a godly king comes onto the scene, the damage has been done, and you've got that here. The rulers are still corrupt, and they're not trusting in God, and the people certainly have been affected by that ungodly leadership before, and that's what we're going to see in the sections that we're covering from chapters 28 to 35. And the main nation that's going to be considered that they will look to for help instead of waiting on Jehovah is Egypt. And that's especially going to be dealt with on Sunday, beginning in chapter 30 and going into chapter 31. But sprinkled throughout this, then, of necessity, is look what happens when you trust in man and trust in yourself and trust in other nations. But this is what you should have been trusting in the whole time. And eventually there's going to be a people who come to, and they do trust in Jehovah. They trust in the Messiah. And there is immense blessings that are going to be seen throughout this as well. Comments, questions before we get to the text? All right, in chapter 28, what you see is a beginning of a series of 6 woes. You might remember in chapter 5, when the vineyard was under consideration, you had a series of 6 woes that were against Judah there, and didn't last as long as what we'll cover in this section. But here's a series of 6 woes. And what he does first is he looks to the drunken and scoffing politicians of Samaria and Judah. Now, he covers Samaria in verses 1 through 4, and there is a look forward in verses 5 and 6 to the Messianic times. A remnant of Israel would be there, and God would then be their glory and their one they look forward for judgment and such, and justice and strength. But then in verse 7, notice it says, "But they also have erred through wine." And so there's a transition in verse 7 of chapter 28. He starts with Israel, and he's done this before, remember? And he looks then to Judah, and basically what he's saying is that you should have learned from Israel, and you didn't. Israel was taken captive first. They fell into idolatry at a very alarming rate, and they were carried off into Assyrian captivity before Judah, and Judah didn't learn. In fact, later on, Jeremiah would prophesy in chapter 3 and verse 8 of his prophecy, "I saw that for all the causes for which backsliding Israel had committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a certificate of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but went and played the harlot also." So that's just a little explanation of what we're seeing here. In verses 1 through 4, Israel is under consideration so that Judah knows, hey, you follow in their footsteps, you'll be numbered among them in judgment as well. So he says, "Woe to the crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim," verse 1, "whose glorious beauty is a fading flower, which is at the head of the verdant valleys, to those who are overcome with wine. Behold, the Lord has a mighty and strong one, like a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, like a flood of mighty waters overflowing, who will bring them down to the earth with his hand. The crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, will be trampled underfoot, and the glorious beauty is a fading flower, which is at the head of the verdant valley, like the first fruit before the summer, which an observer sees, he eats it up while it is still in his hand. So they're proud, they're arrogant. Remember when they're mentioned in chapter 9, they're not learning from the prior judgments. They say, our walls are broken down, but instead of bricks, we'll rebuild with hewn stones. Instead of sycamore, we'll build with cedar. And so they're just these arrogant people, and they think that they have everything under control. And the point, we have our second question, what's the purpose of the repetition of the phrases from verse 1 on into verse 3 and 4, I think, is that you've got this realization you're not in control. You're not going to be spared just because you think that you're above destruction. You're not going to be able to escape this. The pride, as we saw in chapter 26, will be humbled. Remember, the lofty will be brought low. In chapter 25, Moab stands as the pride of all nations, and that doesn't exclude Israel or Judah. They're going to be numbered with the world if they act like the world. And so they're going to be brought low. He mentions drunkards, and he's going to mention that with Judah as well. I think that there is a very literal consideration of this. They were given to strong drink and wine, which intoxicated them. Throughout the Old Testament, that's warned against, and reasons are given as why. But I think there's a very figurative sense of this as well. Kind of, it goes together with literal drunkenness. And I think we see the same thing in the New Testament. You've got sophron and other words that are used to connote sobriety. Nepho, I think, is, don't quote me on that, it's something like that. Has to do with sobriety. And one or the other is figurative and the other is literal. And they're kind of used interchangeably in those kinds of contexts. And it's quite obvious because if you're drunk literally, you're not going to be sober-minded. And if you're not sober-minded, you're acting as if you're intoxicated literally. So they go hand in hand. But we're especially going to see a spiritual connotation here. They are given to wine. They're given to strong drink. And so they're not thinking straight. They're not walking according to the commandments of God. And this is what the New American Standard Bible renders verse 4 as, they will be like the first ripe fig prior to summer. When you've gone all winter, you don't have fresh fruit. Someone's walking down the road and they see a fig tree and it has a ripe fig. It's consumed before they even grab it is the idea. It's quick, it's vicious, and before you know it, it's gone. That's how they're going to be. But in that day, verse 5, the Lord of hosts will be for a crown of glory and a diadem of beauty to the remnant of His people. So someone's going to learn. There's going to be a remnant, and they're going to get the point. We didn't trust in Him before. He should be our trust. He should be our glory. And therefore, He'll be a spirit of justice to him who sits in judgment and strength for those who turn back the battle at the gate. You're going to be able to judge properly because you are relying on God. You're going to have actual strength because you're not relying on yourself or some other man. You're relying on God. And so there is a remnant there that is left for Israel. So then he gets to, in verse 7, Judah. But they also. So not just Israel, but they also have erred through wine and through intoxicating drink, are out of the way. The priest and the prophet had erred through intoxicating drink, or swallowed up by wine, are out of the way through intoxicating drink. They err in vision, they stumble in judgment, for all tables are full of vomit and filth. No place is clean. The fourth question is, what sins are specified in the verses that we just read, verses 7 through 8, as a reason for God's judgment against the nation? Here's kind of where we get this understanding of, obviously there's drunkenness, but what does that lead to? What sins did he describe? Yep. Err in vision and stumble in judgment. That's exactly right. If you're literally intoxicated, how can you possibly see straight to make proper judgments spiritually and act in the proper way spiritually? Remember in Leviticus 10, after Nadab and Abihu made their mistake, there is the instruction for the priest not to be given to intoxicating drink. And you remember what the reason for that was? So they could discern between what? The holy and the unholy. And so if you're inebriated, you can't judge properly. Proverbs 31, King Lemuel is given that instruction as well, because you'll forget the law and pervert justice of all the afflicted. So you've got drunkenness, certainly, but there's a very real spiritual sense to this that comes from a spiritual inebriation, and we're going to see that in chapter 29 in verses 9 and 10. They're drunk, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with intoxicating drink. They're trusting in themselves. When you trust in yourself, there's no way you're going to be walking straight spiritually. You're going to be staggering all over. Did you have something? Yeah. Right. Sure. Yeah, and these are the rulers. These are the priests and the prophets, verse 7. And that's their job, is to lead the people. And what they have to show for it, verse 8, is the tables are full of vomit and filth. Now, very, very likely literally the case. You know how drunkenness works and how it's portrayed in entertainment, but probably experience seeing it for yourself around the world. But table is often used in reference to the spiritual sustenance of the people. And so in Romans, the 11th chapter, a psalm is quoted that has to do with that table will be their snare, it'll be their stumbling. And it's because the Jews held on to the old law when they should have let go of it and held on to Christ. So you have this table that should be filled with spiritual fruit and sustenance, and instead it's just filled with vomit. That's what they have to show for it. And so you reap what you sow is a part of that continuation of thought throughout the Bible and the prophets as well. And then we get to verse 9, what Ronnie was mentioning. I think that what this is these priests and prophets in arrogance asking in a very mocking way, who's going to teach us? He says, whom will he teach knowledge? And whom will he make understand the message? Those just weaned from milk, those just drawn from the breast? For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. So throughout this, you have Isaiah instructing the people to trust in God. Assyria's coming, certainly. You got all these people scrambling. What they're wanting to do is form alliances. They're trusting in other people. And what Isaiah wants them to do is pretty simple. It's pretty fundamental to faith, period. And that's trust in the Lord and wait on the Lord. Do what He says. Walk in holiness. Walk in righteousness. And you'll find deliverance. Sometimes that's hard for us to see. I certainly could understand there being temptation to doubt that when you've got physical armies coming down and bearing upon you. But God's just saying, trust in me, walk in my ways, and you'll deliver me. That's exactly what He's going to do when we get to the historical section. They're not going to be slayed by the sword. An angel's going to take 185,000 of them. That's going to be Jehovah's hand. That's something that is profound yet pretty simple practically. I just do the Lord's will and trust in Him, and He's going to deliver me. Now, that's why they're mocking Isaiah. You're teaching us like we're babes. You're telling us something that simple. You're doing line upon line and precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. And the idea is this fundamental and ascending, gradual instruction, like the ABCs we teach our kids. You got to start small, and you build upon that foundation, and you grow in an understanding. And that's just too simple for these people, is what they're saying. It's not that simple, Isaiah. You're thinking like a child, and you think we're like children, but we're these grown-up politicians. We know how the world works, and that's not what we want. That's not what we're interested in. And I think that there's a very real important application to this spiritually within the church today. You certainly see it with the denominations, but it seems like more and more you're seeing it in the church. I remember a few years ago seeing a sermon shared online, and I was just interested because so many people, it got so much traffic and comments going and stuff. And this is a member of the church. I forget exactly what the title was, but he was basically talking about how we teach a system, and we don't really give the sense of the truth, the sense of the Word. And one of the ways he illustrated that in a very sarcastic tone where a bunch of people laughed, got a lot of laughs, was that you teach a system, you're going to have these kids come along and ask the question, hey, where's that scripture that tells us that we can't use instruments in worship? And you know, as if that's a bad thing to ask that question, period, but he's acting as if it's wrong to do the fundamentals, to talk about the 5 steps of salvation. I even think that was in the sermon, and you're seeing that ridiculed throughout the church today as well. You got, hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. I don't care if it sounds like 5 steps, because you see them in Acts, you see them in the New Testament. But people are ridiculing that as being too simple, missing the point. That's not what it's about. When we teach our children, they may not be able to comprehend the deeper and more expanse matters, but that's the whole point here. You start with line upon line and precept upon precept. You've got command, example, necessary, inference, and you grow from that and you start being able to comprehend the rest of the Scriptures. But people don't like that. It's too simple. It's not complex enough. It's missing the point, is what some will say. When in reality, it is the fundamentals of the whole point. And you cannot understand and comprehend everything else without starting from the beginning. And we've got to be aware of that. And we've got to be careful about that. We've got to stress those basic fundamental principles of authority and re-stress them and revisit them, because you can't grow without that foundation. And that was their problem. They needed to go back to the basics. And that's basically what Isaiah was saying. Trust in the Lord. Wait on the Lord. Lean not on your own understanding. It's as simple as just walking in His ways, bearing fruit to His glory. But you think it's more complicated than that. We've got to get involved in politics. We've got to send out ambassadors. We've got to figure this out ourselves. And Isaiah is saying that's not how it works. And they're scoffing at that. And so we need to be aware of that. Comments, questions there? Yeah, JT. Absolutely. And what we need to understand is that is Christ. He is the Word that became flesh, and there's a very important reason why He's given that title, that description, because He is the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and we're complete in Him, Colossians chapter 2, 9 and 10 says. And we see Christ in the New Testament. That's Christ. When we're talking about imitating Christ, letting Christ dwell in us, having a relationship with Jesus, it's through the Word. And there are going to be some very deep matters, but then there is the very real importance of holding fast the pattern of sound words. You don't have that, you don't have Christ. And so we've got to be humble enough to accept that. So in verse 11 then, here is the consequence. With stammering lips and another tongue, He'll speak to this people. You don't want to hear Isaiah? You don't like what he's saying? I'll speak to you with these foreign people. This is the rest with which you may cause the reader rest, is what He said to him. And this is the refreshing, but they didn't want to hear. And then He repeats this, what they said. And the consequence is that they might go and fall backward and be broken and snared and caught. In Deuteronomy, Moses warned the people, the Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which does not respect the elderly nor show favor to the young. That's Deuteronomy 28, verses 49 through 50. And that's coming into fruition. And so we've seen throughout this teaching through judgment and chastening, they didn't want to hear the simple truth that could have led them to deliverance, as you have in verse 12. And so they'd be taught the hard way. And that's what Isaiah is trying to stress, or God through him. And when you get to chapter 28 and verse 14, you have some more specifics coming into play. And how they're not trusting in God. How are they erring in their ways, out of the way, stumbling around like a drunk, and by not trusting in the Lord. He says, hear the word of the Lord, you scornful men. We saw that in just our previous section. They look with scorn and derision upon the law of the Lord. The ones who rule this people who are in Jerusalem have said, we have made a covenant with death and with Sheol. We are in agreement. When the overflowing scourge passes through that people of stammering tongue, who are the Assyrians, it will not come to us, because we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood we have hidden ourselves. And so he's just saying, we made a pact with death. Assyria's killing everyone else, but because we have a backup plan, namely Egypt, in our back pocket, they're going to help us out. We're not going to die. We're going to be able to handle this ourselves. And he goes on to show that just is not the case, because it's lies and falsehood that they're taking refuge in. And so in contrast to that, he brings us a verse that we're very familiar with in verse 16. Therefore the Lord God says, behold, I lay in Zion a stone for a foundation, a tried stone, a precious stone, a sure foundation, and whoever believes will not act hastily. I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plummet. We'll pause there. One of our questions is, who is that cornerstone? Jesus, right? I heard this all around. Jesus, it's the Christ. He's the cornerstone, and it's applied to him throughout the New Testament, time and time again. In context of a similar nature, I need to turn to God for salvation, and many people rejected Christ, who is the cornerstone, and he became, as Isaiah 8 mentioned, a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense. Now, ultimately, to the people in Isaiah's day, who's going to be their tried and true and precious stone upon which they can build and be successful? It'll be Jehovah. And so this looks forward to the Messiah, but he's essentially saying what he said in verse 12 he had offered. This is the rest, this is the refreshing, but you would not hear. And he'll mention it later as well. It's Jehovah. Put your trust in him. In chapter 26, he is that, in verse 4, everlasting strength, which is an everlasting rock in the New American Standard Bible. He's tried and he's precious and sure. He's got a proven track record. Time and time again, he has proven to be reliable, trustworthy, one to put all of your trust in, all the marbles in that basket. You're going to be able to rely upon him, and whoever does will not act hastily. And that's kind of the contrast here. You're scrambling, you're acting hastily, you're seeking an alliance with Egypt, and that's going to lead to your shame. If you had just trusted in the cornerstone, wouldn't have anything to worry about, and you wouldn't have been ashamed later on. How do you do that, though? When you build on the cornerstone, you build according to the cornerstone. And he says, justice is the measuring line, righteousness the plummet. So here's that fundamental they don't like. Do what the pattern says. Do what the will of the Lord says. Follow Jehovah. Be as he's directing you to be. And you will not be put to shame. But you wouldn't. And so bad things are going to happen. He says in verse 17b, the hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters will overflow the hiding place. So similar language he said in verse 2 of this same chapter, language that he's used in reference to the Assyrians who are coming in, and they'll come in like a flood and go all the way up to the neck and destroy Judah, though Jerusalem will be spared. Your covenant with death, verse 28, or verse 18, it's annulled. It will not stand when it passes through. That is these Assyrians. They're going to trample you down. He says in verse 19, it will be a terror just to understand the report. I tried to get you to understand back here. You could have trusted in Jehovah. This is what's going to be the consequence. You reject it. You make fun of it. And so you're now you're really going to understand by experience. And it's going to be terrible. It's going to be a terror. And so their covenant with death is completely useless. He continues this with an interesting figure in verse 20. The bed is too short to stretch out on, and the covering so narrow that one cannot wrap himself in it. You ever had that problem? I don't know that maybe I've had a problem with the short bed, with the kids' bed or something, but you ever had a blanket, fan's blowing hard, the AC's on, and it's not working for you? It's a little kid's blanket or something. can't get comfortable. It's not doing the trick. It's not covering you. That's this idea. You're stretching out on this bed, and you have this blanket for comfort, for satisfaction. The bed's too short. Your legs are hanging off. The blanket's too narrow. It's not warming you up at all. And in extreme circumstances, that would lead to your death. Your covenant with death, your covenant with Egypt, as we'll see in chapter 30, it's not working. You needed to trust in Jehovah, but this is where your own wisdom gets you. He speaks about the Lord rising up as times before in Perazim, that is against the Philistines, and David's day at Gibeon, with Joshua having victory over the Amorites. The Lord always delivering them into their hands. And then he mentions he's going to do just like he did then, but bring to pass this unusual act. It's unusual because then he delivered the enemies of his people into their hands. Now he's delivering them into their enemies' hands. And we should take that as a warning. Hebrews 10 says the Lord will judge his people. And it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of God. And that's what happened here. He could have been, again, chapter 8, their sanctuary, but instead he became a stumbling block, a stone of stumbling. So he beckons them one more time. Do not be mockers, lest your bonds be made strong. And I have heard from the Lord God of hosts the destruction determined even upon the whole earth. Remember back in chapter 24, that general judgment. Judah's a part of that. You should listen before it's too late. Don't mock what God has said will happen. Anything on that? All right. Interesting section in verses 23 through 29, but it is comforting. I'm not going to read it, but what he does is he gives a figure of plowing and then sowing seed, but then also threshing and reaping. And what it is showing is that God knows what he's doing. He knows that there are particular things that need to be done and certain situations that need to be done differently, and that's certainly exhibited in agriculture, and farmers come to an understanding of that. The Lord gives them the ability to think and reason. They realize what has to be done in this area of work, and they know if they don't conform to natural law and other standards that they have had revealed to themselves through experience or just through people teaching them, that it's not going to go as they want it to go. God is the teacher of that. And he's doing the same thing here with Israel and Judah. He knows just how much affliction to bring them into. He knows just how much they need to experience to be taught. He knows exactly how to deal with them in such a way to bring those people to trust in him finally. That's going to be seen in the days of the Messiah and the remnant especially. But speaking about plowing, does he plow all day? No, he eventually stops when the plowing has done its job. And then he sows some seed like the cumin, he scatters. And then some seed like the wheat and barley has to be planted in rows unless it gathers together and it's too thick and it chokes itself out. And the farmers knew that. Where'd that come from? It's natural law. God is teaching them this. That's God's understanding. And just like the farmer by his instruction would know how to do that, so God knows what he's doing there, and the different way of harvesting that as well plays into that role. That was your thought question. I'm not much on agriculture, so Harry can clean that up when he gets back. So God knows what he's doing. He gives us what we need. He sows what he needs to sow. He cultivates us. He prunes us. That's the point. All of this is working to his glory. So then you get to chapter 29, and you have the formalism in Judah that is considered as a reason for their being judged. He uses the word Ariel, which in your outline you might notice a quote from a Robinson. Ariel is the altar hearth of God. That is Jerusalem, the sacrificial center of Israel's worship. It also could mean the lion of God, where that might have reference to the stronghold of Jehovah's people being Jerusalem, and that being the place where the Messiah would come. I think this idea of the altar hearth makes sense, and not just because it's in the outline, though that kind of helped me think about it at least. But in Ezekiel 43:15, Ariel is translated as altar hearth, and or hearth, and what you have is Jerusalem as the city, as God said He chose for worship, for the sacrifices to be made. And so you've got this center of spiritual life to Jehovah, and instead of them being true to His will and His word and being that pure place of worship and sacrifice, they are the exact opposite. They're just going through the motions and corrupting it with their own commandments and deeds. And because of that, it's actually going to become a fireplace for Jehovah's wrath. He says in chapter 31 and verse 9, whose fire is in Zion and whose furnace is in Jerusalem. You see that in chapter 6 or 29 and verse 6 as well, the flame of devouring fire that will come against them. You could have been the place of burning sacrifices. Instead, you're going to be the place of burning wrath. So he lays a siege against Jerusalem, and this is likely describing Sennacherib's siege against Jerusalem. But notice the eye that is mentioned several times. The Lord is doing this. Assyria is just a tool in His hand. But He is going to spare Jerusalem. And so these people, the Assyrians coming against them, are described as dust, as chaff that passes away, though the Lord is punishing Israel by them, Judah by them. And in verses 7 through 8, they're described in their conquest as having a dream and then waking up to reality. A hungry man dreams of food, a thirsty man dreams of drink, but he wakes up and he realizes that what I consumed in my dream actually didn't do anything for me. They're dreaming of glory and victory. They're dreaming of taking Jerusalem and being the people that inhabit that city. And they wake up to reality. It didn't work. I'm really mad at myself. We got like 4 minutes left, and there's a lot of good stuff that we see even quoted in the New Testament. We're going to have to go through it fast, though. And here's what He calls them to do. He calls them to pause and wonder. You are drunk, but not with wine, staggering, but not with intoxicating drink. What the problem is, the Lord has poured out them a spirit of deep sleep and has closed their eyes of the prophets, closed their heads, that is, the seers. And so you have them staggering around aimlessly as drunks, and it's because God has given them a spirit of stupor in spiritual matters. And remember in chapter 19, that was spoken of with the leaders of Egypt as well. And we stressed that He didn't take away their free will. He didn't strike them in some miraculous way. He gave them up to their own devices. You want to go your own way? I'll let you go your own way. You're not going to know what to do, and it's going to lead to destruction. He speaks about the literate won't be able to read His law. The illiterate won't be able to read His law. So whether you're knowledgeable or you're not, you're simple, it doesn't matter. If you have a dishonesty, if you're wanting to go your own way, you're not going to be able to understand the will of the Lord. And He gives the reason for it in verse 13. They're drawing near with their mouths, honoring with their lips, but they have removed their hearts far from Him. It's ritualistic. It's formalism. They're doing what they're doing without the sincerity of heart. They're going through the motions. And when your heart's not in it, then you're going to start erring in form as well. Their fear toward me is taught by the commandment of men. In chapter 1, he talked about how their head is sick and their heart is sick. When your heart's not right, you're not loving God, then the intellect, all of the other things is going to be wrong. But if your intellect is not right, your heart's not going to be right either. And so that's kind of what's playing into this. It's formalism, and it's leading to corruption in their teaching. We see that quoted in Matthew 15 and other places about the tradition of the scribes and the Pharisees. So what He's going to do, verse 14, is He's going to make the wisdom of their wise men perish, the understanding of their prudent men shall be hidden. Your covenant with death, your alliance with Egypt, that's your wisdom. You thought it was great? Well, I'm going to show you how great it is. That's quoted in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 in regard to bringing the wisdom of the wise to nothing. You can't know God's will through human wisdom. Verses 15 and 16 is quoted in Romans chapter 9 in application to the Jews who claim God is unfaithful because he's casting them away, but that's the clay responding against the potter. God molded and made Israel to bring about the Messiah, and then you rebel against the Messiah and blame it on me as if I'm the one that's not understanding, as if I'm the one that's not right. And that's what they were doing here, claiming that they're smarter than God, claiming that they have a better way than what God is trying to lead them in. It doesn't work that way. If we're wanting to be successful spiritually, we're wanting to serve God acceptably, we're wanting spiritual life, we submit to the potter. We let Him mold us and do whatever it is that He wants to do with us. Nothing else will work. Comments, questions on that? I don't know why I asked that at the end of class.
It reminds me of Revelation chapter 3, verse 17, where He says, "You say, I'm rich, I acquired wealth, and do not need a thing.
Yeah.
But you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked."
Yeah, that's a great point. People that are full of themselves don't realize how full of themselves they are and how vain that is. What I failed to get to in verses 17 through the end of the chapter is messianic, speaking of a time where these people will now understand. They will now rely upon the Lord, and therefore they will be prosperous. Jacob will not be ashamed because they will be hallowing the Lord, fearing Him. They will be understanding and learning doctrine. That's looking to this messianic time when they finally learn the point. Trust in the Lord, not in yourselves or in any other. Thank you for your attention, and you got to deal with me on Sunday again, so sorry about that.
Draw me close to you. Calm now my spirit, peace renew. And yes, I know you hear, for you are near, for you have promised, and I believe. Then I will praise your name forever. Praise your name. I'll give you thanks and magnify your loving favor for me. And I will tell of your salvation, tell all men, for all your promises are true, and I believe. I lift my hand to reach your face, find in your arms a hiding place, to be enfolded there within your care, for you have promised, and I believe. Then I will praise your name forever. Praise your name. I'll give you thanks and magnify your loving favor for me. And I will tell of your salvation, tell all men, for all your promises are true, and I believe. speak your name into the night. Seek through the pain your healing light. And then I will not fear, for you are here, for you have promised, and I believe. Then I will praise your name forever. I'll give you thanks and magnify your loving favor. And I will tell of your salvation, for all your promises are true, and I believe. Secure my heart, Lord, as I kneel. Make sure my trust, my all I yield. Then I'll be one with you in all I do, for you have promised, and I believe. Then I will praise your name forever. I'll give you thanks and magnify your loving favor for me. And I will tell of your salvation, for all your promises are true, and I believe. Thank you for the cross, Lord. Thank you for the price you paid, bearing all my sin and shame. In love you came and gave amazing grace. Thank you for the love, Lord. Thank you for the nail-pierced hands. Wash me in your cleansing flow. Now all I know, your forgiveness and embrace.
Number 202. Beyond the Sand of Parting. 202. Do, sol,